Hi everyone and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel with Right Side Blonde. Today marks my 27th episode of the George Collection. Ironically, George's first issue was from November of 1995, so this year in October will mark the 27th year. It's been 27 years since George graced our worlds. So I thought I would highlight the John Kennedy tribute issue from October of 1999 and just show you all the cool pictures inside of it. It's a really beautiful issue, so I wanted to share it with you. In this issue, the staff took it upon themselves to write their own editor's letter since John was gone, and it's called A Tribute of Our Own. In the weeks following John Kennedy's death, his image lived on newsstands and on televisions everywhere. Magazines and newspapers all published their homages to a life that was lived in the public eye. For a little while, television turned into Univision, with John being the only program. What the media printed and broadcast was a dramatized narrative, beginning with John's birth and filmed through the lenses of countless cameras that had unfolded like a long-running serial, with epic highs and tragic lows leading into each new chapter. That the producers of a fable wanted to distribute their interpretation of its end wouldn't have surprised John a bit. Still, for those of us who worked with John, the process of seeing our colleague's death transformed into the stuff of popular history was unsettling. Certainly we were familiar with many of the images. John as the scion of a mythic family. John as the handsome and glamorous New Yorker with a beautiful and glamorous wife. John as a potential political candidate. During our time at George, we had gotten a backstage look at what John once called the giant puppet show that can turn public people into barely recognizable symbols of themselves. And to be fair, the tributes were almost always kind, mostly accurate, and rightly captured the essence of John, his unfailing generous heart, and his remarkable passion for life. But we were reluctant to participate. At such a time, we found it hard to trust our emotions, to feel confident that we'd be able to say the right things in the proper way. Ultimately, we decided to remember John within the pages of George. Part of our remembrance is manifest in every story and every photograph in this issue, from Al Franken's wonderfully funny report on the GOP's Iowa straw poll to our countdown of the 100 greatest moments of the American century. That's important to note, because John knew that sooner or later this magazine would have to stand on its own. Save for one or two noteworthy exceptions, he didn't want his name on the cover of George or his picture inside. This month, however, we're making an exception by publishing a special section in John's memory. We've tried to tell you about John as we saw him every workday, as an editor and a journalist who founded a magazine with a mission. In our tribute section, you'll find excerpts from his editor's letters and the interviews he conducted for the magazine. John in his own words. We've also included some of his favorite covers and a story about his trip to Cuba to interview Fidel Castro, a fascinating journey for reasons you'll see when you read the piece, never made it into George. Finally, we're publishing a photo gallery of some of the people in public life whom John admired. Whether or not they knew it, he thought they represent the spirit of civic duty that informed his editorial vision and inspired him to create George. John may be gone, but his faith in the virtue of public service is not. From a boxer to a president, these people share that faith. So does this magazine. Thanks for reading. We'll see you next month. This issue is really cool because a lot of the advertisers have posted little messages about John or to John, and one of them from Chanel says, "Above all, he was a gentleman." And it's just a black and white tribute, very touching, very simple. Another thing that caught my eye was on page 43. It's just kind of a gray picture with the Joan of Arc, and the movie, it's a movie advertisement, and it's called The Messenger. It's written in bright red letters. I was just curious what the gematria was on The Messenger, and it comes to 138, which is Donald Trump. So that's kind of cool too. Especially because Donald Trump has become somewhat of our messenger of truth. The John Kennedy tribute inside this magazine is beautiful and very thoughtful, and you can tell that the staff did their absolute best to honor John in their own way in John Kennedy's magazine. It features a quote from John Kennedy that says, "If we can do just one thing at George, we hope it's to demystify the political process, to enable you to see politicians not just as ideological symbols, but as lively and engaging men and women who shape public life." Like was mentioned in the editor's letter written by the staff, they took some of John Kennedy's editor's letters from previous months and previous issues and put them into this tribute, and I've actually read a lot of those in my previous episodes. So if you want to go back and watch those, you can hear them in their entirety and hear my thoughts on them. Today, I wanted to read about when John Kennedy visited Fidel Castro, because this didn't make it into the George magazine as John intended, and you'll see why here. So this is called A Night in Havana by Inigo Thomas. And this is a really cool story. I think you'll enjoy. A meeting between John Kennedy and Fidel Castro on any day in any year would have been historic. Yet the night the two men met had a further dimension. The son of the 35th president was meeting his father's nemesis 35 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the worst moment of the Cold War, when the end of the world seemed as likely as its survival. As John knew well, this was provocative timing for an interview with Castro, but like every journalist who has traveled to Cuba in pursuit of the dictator, John had no assurance that Castro would grant him an audience. Few things are certain in this last communist outpost, and soon after John, the photographer Herb Ritz and his assistant David Jackal and I arrived in Havana on October 23, 1997, we realized this uncertainty included lunch. Escorted by a young man from the Foreign Ministry, John was introduced to a phalanx of pale-faced government officials. Fair skin is still a cherished status symbol on this Caribbean island. He was also shown the Bay of Pigs and the city of Santa Clara, the scene of the culminating battle of the Cuban Revolution. But after 4 lunchless days and no word of an interview, John's standing joke was that a meal before 6 p.m. was as elusive as Castro himself. It therefore seemed fitting that when John finally received a call at 5 on Sunday afternoon telling him to be ready for dinner with Castro at 9 o'clock, he thought of it as yet another late lunch. Castro reputedly had 7 homes in Havana, never sleeps in the same place 2 nights in a row, and never decides on a rendezvous until the last minute. Sounds like a typical communist. This dinner would take place at the Council of Ministers, a large 1950s building just behind the Plaza de la Revolucion. As John readied himself at the Melia Cohiba Hotel for an interview he had described as an anvil over his head, he was acutely aware that the meeting could spark as much controversy as curiosity. A small gathering of Cuban officials welcomed John at the top of the stairs, among them Ricardo Alarcon, head of the National Assembly and widely believed to be a successor to Castro. José Ramón Fernández, the commander of the forces that defeated the CIA-sponsored landings at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, and Castro's translator identified only as Juanita. They offered no clue as to the nature of the evening ahead, although John was told that a tape recorder would not be welcome. This was to be a private meeting, not an occasion for an interview. So I handed over the briefcase full of notes, microphones, and tapes to an aide, and Fernandez encouraged John to lead the group down a corridor lined with palms and tropical plants. There, in a room to the right, standing alone and dressed in green combat fatigues, was Fidel Castro Ruz. The first jokes made at Castro's expense in the 1950s, when few Cubans took his dreams of revolution seriously, were about his beard. That once rebellious mane is now gray and thinning, but what you immediately notice about the dictator is his eyes. For a regime that prides itself on its informal manner and casual dress, how you look at people says a lot about who you are. And while most Cuban officials look away when they shake hands, Castro stares you directly in the eye, his gaze an expression of his absolute power. After Castro greeted John, he looked down and noticed the lightweight cast that protected John's right hand. He had injured it a few weeks earlier. "What have you done?" Castro asked, apparently worried that the injury had been inflicted on the island. No, John answered. "This happened a while ago, in New York." Castro then formally welcomed John to Cuba. He hoped the trip had been interesting, which prompted John to give an account of his journey, the meetings with the officials, the battlefields, the museums, and we never have time for lunch, he joked. Castro smiled. "We shall be having a modest supper tonight," he said. "Some shrimp, a little consommé." A waiter brought a tray of ready-mixed martinis, rum, whiskey, mango juice, and wine, and Castro began to talk about what he was currently reading, books by Churchill and Stefan Zweig, the Austrian author who fled the Nazi occupation only to commit suicide in exile in Brazil. "Tell me," Castro then inquired of John, "are you much the same size as your father?" John replied that he was young when his father died, and that his memory had been shaped in part by photographs and television, but that, yes, there were similarities, although his father had been a little taller and a little thinner. With the exception of Juanita, whose ability to remember and then translate Castro's sentences seemed limitless, none of the guests had said a word since the handshake. As Castro ushered us into the dining room next door, placing John immediately opposite him, it was clear that their silence would continue for the rest of the night. Awkward. Over courses of grapefruit, consommé, shrimp, chicken, and ice cream, Castro delivered one of his legendary 5-hour performances, the kind he usually gives in a town square before thousands of Cubans who have no choice but to listen. The manner in which Castro speaks doesn't lend itself to memory. His labyrinth remarks begin with an observation or point, emphasized by extending the index finger of his right hand and drawing it close to his face. He meanders into territory that bears little relation to the original statement, but eventually returns to his starting point. He expressed his amazement at Pope John Paul II's ability to wake at 5 in the morning. He applauded the socialism of the Mormon Church, and he vented his opposition to the Catholic Church's view of abortion and his belief that it would be impossible for modern Cuban women not to have the right to choose whether they wanted to have a baby. And he talked about the missile crisis and the Bay of Pigs, the great moments of the past when Cuba was at the center of the world. But it was his voice, sometimes quiet but always impassioned, that carried the evening, the meaning of his words often mattering less than the intonation. Some of his remarks, though, were particularly striking. He spoke of his admiration for President Kennedy, how brave he had been to accept the blame for the Bay of Pigs, and how U.S.-Cuban relations might have been repaired had the president lived. But the longer the evening wore on, the harder it was to absorb what we were hearing. When Castro was speaking disdainfully of President Nixon, as John recalled the following day, it was impossible not to become fixated on the lonely shrimp stuck at the end of his fork, which never made it closer than 6 inches of Castro's mouth in a half an hour. Occasionally, Castro interrupted himself to ask his guest about his family and other more private aspects of his life, and John would reply with the polite discretion that he deployed in the face of his most inquisitive interviewers. Though John was patient for almost the entire night, he did show one flash of frustration. That's pretty good. "Are you preparing an article on the missile crisis?" Castro asked. "Well, we were," John replied sardonically. At 2 in the morning, when Castro had exhausted both himself and his audience, the evening drew to a close. We stood up from the broad table that had been our theater and bid our farewells on the top of the same stairs where we'd been greeted 5 hours earlier. John thanked his host for the evening and the journey around Cuba. "I'll bring my wife the next time I come," he said, "and next time I'll come on vacation." Castro grinned and said, "I hope so. There's much more to see." Then, as we walked down toward a waiting minivan, Castro and his silent subordinates waved goodbye. The following day, on the plane home, I realized that Castro had said something of unexpected significance. At the time, I hadn't paid particular attention to the remark, but the more I thought about it, I recognized that the night had been leading up to this moment. As we were leaving the dining room with the cigars we had received as gifts, Castro abruptly stopped walking. "You know, Lee Harvey Oswald was trying to come here," he said, half a question, half declaration. In October 1963, Oswald had applied for a visa at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, but his request had been denied. "Yes, I did know that," John replied. Castro paused, then said, "It was a difficult time, and you know we didn't let many Americans into Cuba." "Yes." Castro lifted his head and walked on. This short exchange is a riddle of sorts, and exactly what Castro meant is impossible to say. But immediately after he heard John's last answer, a sense of relief washed over his face. Maybe he was offering a veiled apology. He knew that if Oswald had been allowed in Cuba in October 1963, then he might not have been in Dallas a month later. Sitting on the Mexicana flight back to New York, I mentioned the possibility to John. He thought about it for a few moments, nodded, and said nothing. A quote I find extremely fitting for today's current events, I'll call them, is, "In the most challenging of times, men and women of courage and conviction make a difference." That was a quote from John Kennedy in a speech that he made for George. And on the page with one of my absolute favorite pictures of John Kennedy, it says, "Politics is too important to be left to the politicians." We as Americans have a very important job to do in the near future. Like John Kennedy said, politics is too important to be left just to politicians. We the people have to stand up, and we have to do our part as well. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the George Collection. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.
Magazine, George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we We decided, I mean, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late-night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process, and while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.